All right. Hello, Catholic YouTube. Brian with City of the Immaculata back with you. StreamYard is now letting me know that it looks like the internet connection's a little bit unstable there, so I'm going to keep an eye on the chat. You guys just let me know how I'm doing. Good morning, everyone. Good to see you there. Right now, it seems to be okay, so I'm going to roll with it. All right, so I had scheduled this particular talk a while back, and I thought to myself that this one would be in the bag since it was a continuation of a talk that I gave months ago, and I had ran out of time. It was supposed to be a one-time, one-and-done thing, and then looks good on y'all. All right, appreciate it, guys. Thanks for letting me know. It was supposed to be like a one-time thing, and then it's such a long conversation that I ran out of time. But then I thought, you know what? I've got the notes good to go. I'll pick it up when I get a chance. So I scheduled this, and then I went to go back and review my notes, and it turned out that I must not actually have saved them because I couldn't find them anywhere. So yay for me. So I had to go back. I re-listened to the last talk that I gave on Chalcedon, see where I left off, and then I kind of had to redo this whole thing, which is fine. You know, I mean, I've got my sources are pretty consistent and close by. So hopefully this kind of picks up if you were to like catch this later and you've watched the first part, now you're watching the second part. Hopefully this kind of like picks up properly. I am going to backtrack a little bit just to kind of rehash and catch us up for those that may not be familiar, though I do recommend going back and watching that first one. And just to kind of get things started, I wanted to say here that people, at least from so I've been told, people generally appreciate the way that I approach and present history. And as I'm like writing, you know, as I'm writing up notes for these talks and as I'm writing up notes on this one, I was thinking, like, why is it that people have responded positively to the way that I present history? And I think it's partly due to the fact that I always try to look at history from these like interdimensional vantage points. I think people sometimes get really myopic and they get the pieces to the puzzle maybe, but they have a hard time kind of putting it all together. So for example, when you see something like Chalcedon as a like standalone event, I really try to weave all of the threads, you know, as many as I reasonably can. It's always more to that could be like sewn together, but I try to weave it all into a like concise narrative and do it in a way that I hear a lot of people say after the fact, like, oh yeah, I hadn't really considered it from that angle or how it was related to this. And one angle that I really need you guys to consider, it's kind of key to this lecture, the last lecture on Chalcedon, and then this one moving forward, is that while the events are underway, no one knows the outcome to this stuff. And I really like that may sound like an exercise in the obvious, but the cliche that hindsight is 2020 here very much applies because centuries on, we know how the story is going to play out. We know that eventually the imperial party would go towards the Roman Leonine formula over the Alexandrian, but at the time, in many instances, it seemed that the exact opposite was actually transpiring, and that the party of Dioscorius would win the day, would win the century. So it's key to never lose sight that in real time, there's no like, oh, I know the Catholic Church is going to prevail. All is well. Let me sit back and rest. And as I was kind of re-pulling this talk together, getting all the notes together for it, I was like, okay, where do I want to take this? And what I've come up with is I plan to kind of jump back and forth between the immediate fallout of the council. Well, first I want to do a quick recap, follow up just with the sort of explosive response to the council, and then I want to go back to like that immediate aftermath and give an overarching view of the next few, really for the next few centuries as best as I can, because it's really not until Islam arrives and cuts Byzantium off from the Monophysite world that the problem is like resolved, where it pretty much it's codified as this perpetual schism that we see that continues to our own day. Because after that, you get to the point where the Catholic world would eventually go on to combat iconoclasm, which is a bit of a turn in the trajectory of the church moving forward. Up to that point, the conciliar events especially were all various attempts to resolve the split that had taken place from Chalcedon. And it's actually an interesting thing to note that Protestants, early Protestants anyways, and I want to be like clear about that. I'll probably have to mention, I was having a conversation the other day with a Protestant friend of mine, and I've had to make this like disclaimer several times, and I should probably make it when I bring it up on my channel. My own limited knowledge of the Protestant world is pretty, I mean, I could give you kind of a generalized overview, but as far as what I know specifically, I'm pretty much limited to the very early Protestant history. First, a little bit into second generation Protestantism. And even then, I mainly have looked at the history. I haven't gone so deep into all of the theology. But as far as that goes, the early reformers, first, second generation of reformers, believed in the, you could put it in quotes, the validity of the first 4 ecumenical councils. Now, they didn't teach that they were infallible as such, right? Because remember, Protestants, for them, it was only insofar as the councils are in accord with sacred scripture. But they did acknowledge that there was something good and true with these first 4. And after Chalcedon, Luther, Chemnitz, and some of these others begin to see the councils as descending into imperial politics, which in some ways is true. As a historian, I cannot sit here and say that we can like so easily separate the behind the scenes shenanigans from the holy decrees that proceed forth from. I wish it were that easy. But even as a good Catholic, I think it's fair, with caution, to say that there is something unique about the first 4 ecumenical councils, and that with the loss of Alexandria after Chalcedon, something different is happening, at least in, if not in the spirit, because the church is always one. When people schism, there isn't like 2 churches all of a sudden. There's always only going to be one church. So if not in spirit, then at least in whatever effect that the optics has on our reality and on the world's perception of Christianity, for that matter. And we'll get into that a little bit. But for now, where did we leave off? So just a quick recap, in 449, Emperor Theodosius II calls upon Dioscorus, the patriarch, the pope, as he's known in Alexandria, to convene a council to address the rising issues of the divergences in thought between Dioscorus's own Alexandria and that of Antioch. Alexandria being more under the influence of the great Saint Cyril, who in their eyes stressed the divine aspects of the God-man, versus the Antiochians, who stressed the aspects of Christ's human nature. So this council meets, and it is a crap show. To put it in a blunt way, you have Saint Flavian, the Bishop of Constantinople, physically beaten at the altar by supporters of Dioscorus. He dies later from his injuries. This council ends. It is ratified by the Emperor Theodosius II, who then dies. Excuse me. In the meantime, Pope St. Leo the Great receives the acts of the council, condemns it, declares it null, declares it a robber synod, and excommunicates all those involved with its decisions. And he calls for a legitimate council to be held, which the new emperor, Marcion, agrees. And from there, we get Chalcedon, and we get Leo's own tome on the two natures of Jesus Christ and the hypostatic union winning the day. And at this point, the history gets a little bit confusing. if it's not already, just kind of strap yourselves in. I'm going to do my absolute best to keep the names and events as accessible as possible for a 1-hour lecture. But just remember, we're talking about the span of several centuries with some very confusing issues. I do recommend, again, going back, watching that first video just to give you the full context. I may even repost it for people that are maybe catching this later. But I think the very first thing to consider after the council, before we sort of parcel out any of the theological decrees, is that let's give some consideration to the political decisions as they're taking place, remembering always in the back of our mind that people do not know what the outcome of this is going to be in real time. So as these political decisions are ultimately, they're going to inform the theological decisions. And I just want you to imagine living at any given time during one of these emperors, because to give you an idea, at least from an imperial vantage, of how unstable all of this is, I'm going to look at it from the position of the Byzantine emperors from Marcion forward and what their position is theologically, so that you can see just how confusing this may be for a person living real time. So to begin with, at the end of Chalcedon, we have Marcion, Emperor Marcion, as we mentioned, emperor from 450 to 457. He is a Catholic. He's followed up by Emperor Leo I, 457 to 474. He is a Catholic. After him, we get Emperor Zeno from 474 to 475 with a brief interruption, and then again from 476 to 491, and he is a Monophysite. And I'm going to come back to some of these people, but one important sidebar is to remember right here at this point, as he is emperor in the Byzantine East, keep in mind we have reached at this point the fall of the Roman West, when Odoacer, the barbarian, has captured Italy at this point. So we have, and the last of the Western Augustuses is overthrown. So we have the temporary loss of the West, at least until Belisarius's campaigns a few decades later. So at this point, Rome is on its own, right? It's a different thing. But in the interim period between Zeno falling out and then coming back to power, you have Basiliscus from 475 to 476. He's a Monophysite. You have Emperor Anastasius I from 491 to 518. So let me do just a quick, let me see. So at this point, you have roughly about 44 years of a Monophysite emperor, which is a considerable time. Think back to where the world was 44 years ago from now, right? You're talking the changing from the 70s to the 80s. That feels like a long time ago. So you've got that long now of a Monophysite imperial ruler coming after the years of Chalcedon. Then we move over to the Justinian dynasty, beginning with Justin in 518 to 527. And I'm going to label some of these as what I'm going to call pragmatists. While they may interiorly fall on one side or the other, the Justinian dynasty in particular, but moving forward some more of these other emperors, they tend to start seeing imperial politics as kind of being above the fray of this, and they really just want to bring back stability, because at this point, like I said, we're almost 50 years into this, and they're going to begin to see, wow, this is a real problem. This is not resolving so easily. We have to come up with some pragmatic solutions. So I'm going to call Justin a pragmatist. I'm going to call the successor to him, Justinian, the great Justinian, 527 to 565, a pragmatist, even though he's technically would have been considered a Catholic emperor. His wife, who we're going to come back to as well, Theodora, is a very, very influential woman and a Monophysite herself. It's under the reign of Justinian that we get the first council after Chalcedon, the fifth council, the second council of Constantinople. Then we have Justin II from 565 to 578. He's somewhat of a pragmatist. I would kind of put him in that realm. He did persecute the Monophysites, so he would consider himself a Catholic if you were to ask him, but he as well is realizing the instability of this schism. So from this point forward, you're really dealing with kind of pragmatist kind of minded emperors. Tiberius II, 578 to 582, he's a pragmatist. Maurice, 582 to 602. And again, just keeping in mind, the reason I'm saying this is because while somebody like Maurice doesn't personally persecute, in his case, the Monophysites, as he supported Chalcedon, he also wasn't really winning friends, because while the emperor wanted to see himself above the fray were completely fractured and splintered, and there's like a almost palpable war going on between these two parties at this point, as we're going to kind of cover as we come back into some of this. So the emperor, just because you want to play Mr. Pragmatist, you're not necessarily winning support on the ground by trying to appease both sides. Then we have Emperor Phocas in 602, from 602 to 620. He's a Catholic. We have Heraclius, 610 to 641. He's a Catholic. I'm going to come back to him. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, he's the one he's going to try to unite all of the various factions again. So you could probably label him one of these pragmatists within the empire, with his new formula that he is going to consider more inclusive and more elastic. The monogenerists, right? At this point, it's going to move into a argument. We're going to get into this, but it's going to move into an argument about the Christ's will. Then we have several Catholic emperors up until Constans II from 641 to 668. He's a real pragmatist. He actually ends up persecuting Pope St. Martin I. And then we get another series of Catholic emperors, but with Emperor Philippicus from 711 to 713. While he was claiming to be a Catholic, he's also at the same time abolishing the acts of Third Constantinople, the Sixth Ecumenical Council that takes place in 681, leading to a schism with Rome. So hopefully, guys, that's a little bit of an indicator of just kind of how uncertain things are at this point. And again, keeping in mind the realist vantage point of living as a person in these times, you don't know what it's going to be like. Like I said, we're here centuries removed from this stuff, or we have a much better vantage point. Try to think about how's the liturgical wars going to end that are taking place right now. What are they going to 200-300 years from now? People will have a much better vantage point of what's taking place right now, where we don't know where things are going to end up. We don't know what's going to happen with the extraordinary form, or how the ordinary form is going to move. We don't know these things. And it's and even on an extreme level after Chalcedon, if you think things are bad now, we're going to get into some of that. But after that point, again, the imperial party starts to move into this iconoclastic era. And I'm sure you all kind of see the how volatile and unstable all of this is. And this is just imperial. This is just an imperial view, right? We haven't even said much about the constant state of strife that the ecumenical patriarch in Constantinople, how they're often pawns of the crown's attempts at concessions, and how this places the ecumenical patriarch, you know, whether he happens to be a Monophysite or a Catholic, depending on the needs of the emperor at any given moment. The ecumenical patriarch in Constantinople is in a near constant state of strife for these years and these decades and these centuries. Let me emphasize that. So now, backing up again to after Chalcedon, there's a lot riding on how the imperial powers, as you could imagine, which way the imperial powers are going to fall on these things. As far as Rome is concerned, Rome proper, the matter's settled after Chalcedon, right? The Pope has spoken, the Ecumenical Council has spoken, the matter's closed. But we all know with practical politics, though we know that the Holy Spirit protects us, at the time you'd be sitting on the edge of your seats, right? Like, okay, Holy Spirit, any day now, come on ahead and step on in here and take care of this. While there are religiously motivated emperors, more often than not, the emperors, especially from the Justinian period moving forward, they really were focused on the stability of the empire, because at many times the empire is up against the Persians from the east, who are, you know, the Persians, an invading force that you're vying for power with, would love to take advantage of the instability in your own territories. No ruler wants a religious war amongst his subjects, especially when you've got enemies at the gates. And the allegiances over religion very easily spill into allegiances over the crown. And as is the case following Ephesus, as we covered last time, the hostilities between the two factions are at oftentimes come to violence, and they could be quite retributive. It was nothing for a Monophysite when in power, whether that's an ecclesial or temporal secular power, to crush the Catholics, or when the Catholics were in power to crush the Monophysites. If you ever wondered why Africa fell so easily later to Islam, it is in part due to the fact that the Monophysites of Egypt were at that point on the losing receiving end of the Byzantine throne, and the Monophysites of Egypt saw the Muslim conquerors as a reprieve, not a threat. None of the caliphs of Islam really ever gave a damn about the internecine conflicts taking place among Christians, and they would actually quickly stamp out any group that was trying to persecute the other. The Monophysites of Egypt said they'd rather be ruled by the turban than by the mitre of Constantinople, to borrow from a phrase that would take place later. All right, so that's the summary of things after Chalcedon. Excuse me, right after Chalcedon. But imagine, right? You've got Second Ephesus ratified. It's done. Dioscorius and the Alexandrian party have won the day. Then boom, the emperor dies. Then you get Chalcedon ratified in the opposite direction, and that's done. Then you have two emperors spanning about 25 years, which are Catholic, and then boom, you get Zeno, and then you get Monophysites for about 50 years. And Zeno is a very active and powerful leader. He promulgates this document called the Heterodoxy, written by the ecumenical patriarch, his own personal pawn, as we've stated, a man named Acacius, as an attempt at compromise that says, okay, we will agree with the condemnations of Eutyches and Nestorius at Chalcedon. We'll even agree with the 12 condemnations of Cyril. But that whole tome, that whole two natures thing of Jesus Christ, let's just forget about that for right now, right? Let's just all be kumbaya. Let's forget about that. The ecumenical patriarch says, the initial one says no. Zeno says, okay, you're gone. Here's one that says yes, Acacius. In the meantime, the Pope in Rome says absolutely not. We've already ratified the Acts of Chalcedon. Leo's letter was definitive from the moment it was penned, and we get what's known at that point as the Acacian Schism. And as all of this is going on, remember that the last of the Western Augustuses has fallen in 476 to Odoacer, which means by this point, civilly and administratively, Rome is somewhat independent for the moment, as Odoacer isn't really concerned with governing the city. He leaves Rome to administrate for itself. So this, in fact, really begins this long road towards true Roman independence for the church, which, of course, will lead to various problems later with the empire. But so we are officially in schism when Anastasius I becomes emperor. Again, he's a staunch Monophysite who doesn't agree to actually even to the compromise and wants to condemn Chalcedon altogether. So we end up with a general persecution of Catholics at this point. Anastasius has a pretty healthy reign for a Byzantine emperor, anyways, of lasting about 27 years. So that's that quarter century there that we were talking about. Between him and Zeno, you're dealing with almost 50 years. But he's the last of the Leonid dynasty, and after him we get Justin. And that's where things get really confusing. Justin, as we said, while a Chalcedon Catholic, in conviction is also that pragmatist, and he wants that stability. And he cannot keep this schism with Rome, right, the old Rome, ongoing, because it's not a good look for anybody to be in schism with the Pope in Rome. And an amazing and honestly providential coup in hindsight for the Roman Church, Pope Hormisda sends a delegation to Constantinople that effectively says no negotiations will take place. Here's our list of demands. And Justin says, okay. It's an event that, dare I say, haunts the Eastern Orthodox apologists to this day. And the irony of this Latin Pope with a Greek name, with this Leonine sense of the papacy, is all pretty amazing. It's kind of its own story. I recommend just sort of looking at what's going on with the Acacian Schism and how it's resolved for some of you history buffs out there. Then we get Justinian. What to say about Justinian? Certainly one of the most important rulers in all of history. Administratively, militarily, religiously, he has a very long reign. I mean, we're talking like 40 years. It's pretty significant for a Byzantine emperor. At times, he's wildly indecisive, though, and at other times, he's on the forefront of events. So it's an amazingly confused period. Religiously, I would say he's fairly moderate. Some may disagree with that, but I would say he's fairly moderate, though he eventually does swing kind of hard to the Chalcedon side. But he's also still that ever the pragmatist that wants peace restored. Now, in one of the oddest turns of Byzantine imperial history, he marries a woman of ill repute named Theodora, who in her own right is one of the great rulers of history. But for our concerns here today, is a Monophysite herself. Now, as always for Monophysite rulers, Rome is ever the thorn in her side. She wants to put her own man in. She and Justinian want to make Constantinople responsible for approving who takes the seat in Rome, and they begin this period known as the Byzantine captivity of the papacy. It's a really fascinating period. I'll probably cover that at another point. It's just an amazing series of events that take place. But right here in the beginning, one of the biggest challenges to the history of the papacy happens when they take this man that they want named Vigilius. And it would take way too long to go through all of this in inadequate detail. But in short, Justinian, at the same time that all of this is going on, where his wife is trying to get her man Vigilius into Rome, into the seat in Rome for the papacy, at the exact same time, Justinian is using the general Belisarius, who's one of the greatest military generals in all of history, Belisarius is sweeping across North Africa. He comes up, crosses into Rome, takes over the Italian peninsula. So Belisarius puts Rome back into the imperial sphere. Now, Theodora wants to take advantage of this and get her man, Vigilius, into the papacy, and she manages to do so through a series of real shenanigans. And the astonishing thing is that immediately Vigilius, though he promises to be her yes man, does an about face once he becomes the Pope. Meanwhile, Justinian calls for a council, Second Constantinople, that leaves, practically speaking, things worse off afterwards than they were before. How do we even begin with Second Constantinople? You have at Constantinople dead men who can't defend themselves being condemned. The Pope is in exile at this point. Vigilius is refusing to attend the council. Everything is in like a near constant state of duress, especially the Pope. Schism breaks out, and for all intents and purposes, it does not bring back into full communion the Monophysites. As for all that they're trying to do and all that they're trying to attempt, it doesn't even work because war with Persia breaks out, and then eventually the Arabs come in and undermine all chances at reunion anyways. So from that point forward, though, as far as future events are going to go, you really begin to see this trend towards a more orthodox Catholic position coming from the empire. Though, as I said, as far as Chalcedonian Christianity is concerned, though I said, the emperors themselves at various times will reunite, including people like Heraclius, who had just successfully defeated the Persians. He attempts this solution, he and his successors, with a compromise that, again, it's very convoluted, but I'm just giving it to you guys so that you can kind of get used to just how wild these times are. His solution ends in the persecution, as I stated earlier, of Pope Martin I, as well as the great Saint Maximus the Confessor, who both held that Jesus Christ has two wills. Now, we're not talking about natures at this point. We've moved on from natures to an attempt at a compromise by discussing wills, and Pope St. Martin I and Maximus the Confessor agree that that the monoenergist formula is actually heretical. So trying to bridge the gap by using that is not going to work. Eventually, all of that leads to Third Constantinople and no reunion, as attested to the fact that the Oriental Orthodox exist to this day. So spoiler alert, you're not going to ever see, and all of this, all the way up until Second Nicaea, it's these various attempts to reconcile everything that had happened in the aftermath of the fake council, Second Ephesus, and Chalcedon. Because remember, as far as Second Ephesus goes, the Oriental Orthodox consider that a valid, legitimate council. They consider, keep in mind hindsight 2020 here, they consider Chalcedon to be the robber council, because as far as certain reception theories go, the Oriental Orthodox have a case to be made, depending on where you fall on these matters, if you want to be consistent in your arguments about how a council is received, because it had the imperial signature, it had the majority of bishops, even though there is arguments of duress and things like that, we don't necessarily have our hands clean from our own ecumenical councils about things like certain signatures taking place at certain times on councils that we as Catholics consider valid. So, yeah, depending on your vantage point, right, these matters are very much not settled, and the discussion really goes on to this day. And I think part of the importance to all of this is to remember, especially when folks who want to condemn, say, a received council like the Second Vatican Council in our own lifetimes as a failure, as if that's quote unquote failure, as if that testifies to anything of value to determining its validity. Well, those same people would have a lot to answer for when it comes to some of these other councils, and sit down and talk to the Oriental Orthodox if you doubt me on that, about, the position on the how blurry it gets once you get into Chalcedon, because And I know there's various arguments made from various people at various times, but I think when you sort of strip all of the things away, if you have a consistent logical way of viewing these things, and then you look at the history of what's taking place, I don't think you can. And the Oriental Orthodox, and they say this is why they don't agree to Chalcedon, is that you basically have a papal diktat deciding that this other council is not legitimate, and we are therefore going to hold another council. And here's the tome that you guys are going to sign off on. And I know there's arguments, oh, well, the bishops at the council, they read Leo's tome before well, okay, they read it, but that's not really an argument against what's actually taking place, because Leo doesn't send that tome. In his mind, Leo is not sending this tome that he's just written on the two natures of Christ, thinking, well, I'm just going to go let these bishops go hash this out. What is his intention when he is sending it out? And that's this Roman position kind of moving forward, is like, this is a settled matter. And so I don't even know what the Orthodox are going towards, the Eastern Orthodox here. I don't know what they're exactly claiming when they argue, oh, well, the bishops argued about okay, so let's just say if the bishops had decided against Leo's tome, is the argument then therefore that they would have rejected Leo's tome, and then what? All of a sudden you would have a Chalcedon that agreed with Second Ephesus, and how do you think the papacy would have responded? Well, it would have been a schism. It would have been a schism with Byzantium at that point, much like the Acacian schism later turned into. So it's no real argument saying that these Eastern Orthodox, or these bishops that the Eastern Orthodox want to say, well, they I know, like, as far as like an ecclesial structure, the point that they're trying to make is, well, they in their minds didn't see Leo's letter as being official and final, the final word. Well, okay, well, then now you're having a meeting of two minds, because you have two different people with two different perceptions at that point. Which one's correct, right? Is Leo correct, or are the bishops at the council correct? And that's where I think we would have more fruitful discussions if we would start acknowledging some of these things at a more foundational level. And I don't even really, I don't spend a lot of time on this channel defending like Vatican II from the men and women who, honestly kind of speak on behalf of the devil. But in so much as I can help you guys extrapolate certain key events and place them, at least using some of these metrics, right? Like, as we're talking about here, again, sit down and have a conversation with an Oriental Orthodox that's well informed, and you'll find that you could actually have a really good, fruitful conversation with them, because you're beginning with that same logical foundation that, hey, we have declared your council null and void by this decree from the Pope, and they're going to say, yeah, you did, and we don't agree to that. But that's ultimately we're in agreement on what happened historically there. Another thing I think we need to keep in mind is just the sheer, and I really went into this last time, but there was an almost embarrassing level of violence that comes from all of this, and never lose sight of that. Both sides, man, it's really frustrates me. We have, at the behest of Justin II, who makes Patriarch of Constantinople John Scholasticus. Well, at first he finds a solution that brought peace for about 1 year. John comes in and he comes up with the solution. Justin's like, I want you to solve this. Give me a solution, bring peace. He comes up with a solution that lasts about 1 year, until the Monophysites, who had agreed with this solution that John had come up with, once again began publicly condemning Chalcedon. So at that point, John of Constantinople writes, in an angry decree, we have commanded that all the places where the Monophysite believers assembled should be shut up. Their altars should be razed. Their priests and bishops should be seized and cast into prison, and all who meet there for worship driven away, dispersed, and commanded to never meet again. Then you have Monophysite historian John of Ephesus. Keep in mind, though, when it comes to these historians at this point, you're dealing with men that have very much an agenda. So always read their accounts of things with a grain of salt on both sides. But you have John of Ephesus writing about this list of persecutions that the Monophysites are experiencing at the hands of Chalcedonian Christians. And there's this story where the Patriarch of Constantinople sent men to the Monophysite bishop of Cyprus, where they had orders to beat him with clubs until he vomited blood or consented to their communion. 12 of them accordingly beat him until he fell down speechless in the midst and lay apparently dead. But on seeing him lie motionless and dying, as it seemed, they ran and brought 4 pails of water, which they dashed over him. And so after a long time, his soul returned to him again, and he returned to life from the dead. And thus by force he was compelled to submit to communion with them. Then I think you have one of the most consequential things take place, in my opinion, of all of this, that has a lasting effect in the minds of those involved, where you have some of the Byzantine clergy start forcing the Monophysite priests to be reordained if they were going to be brought into the Chalcedonian faith. Now, I don't claim to know all of the details of the arguments on both sides of this. My limited time that I've spent studying Anglican orders has taught me that it's a subject where angels fear to tread when you're trying to determine, whether a group of people have valid sacraments or not, but especially when it comes to things like orders. But regardless, it is said now at this point by these clergy, by this act, that this is not just a schism, this is a different faith, and that there's a real defect in the sacraments of the Oriental Orthodox Church. Now, granted, Rome was never really comfortable with all of this. See, I mean, one of the things I think you guys have to realize about the Roman Church, and I mean that like explicitly as the Roman Church, as those within the sphere of Rome at the time, specifically around what later eventually become the Papal States. Not the Gallican, not the Celtic or the Byzantine or the like just specifically the Roman Church. The church in Rome has this long-standing reputation of being a conservative voice, and I'm using conservative like colloquial here, but so often in this time, and really on up to the modern Rome, following, say, all the way up to the point of the French Revolution, but especially here in these earlier centuries, churches, bishops, monks, whomever would turn to Rome to get clarity. For one thing, the Roman Church had long adapted Latin, which for all intents is a fairly precise and conservative language, not given to some of the ambiguities of the Greek-speaking world. So for things like rebaptism, reordination, for the Tome of Leo, on condemning dead theologians, for the Filioque, which had been adopted by the Spanish Gothic Church and picked up by the Franks long before Rome adopted it, for the Frankish and the iconoclastic Byzantines regarding images. Rome was like the voice of reason through all of this. So keep that in mind, right? When studying issues of the papacy of this period, why people, they may not have had a perfectly formulated ecclesiology of the Roman Church that you would see maybe develop in the High Middle Ages, but practically on a ground level, people quite often, including many saints, recognized by both sides, Eastern Orthodox, and earlier, before Chalcedon, saints recognized by all sides, but really especially you have a lot more to account for in some of the later centuries of the first millennium, why so many of these people turned to Rome for clarifications. And we could argue, well, maybe, yeah, like, okay, so that develops into something later, but the Holy Spirit protecting Holy Mother Church gives us these like clear, visible signs of how we can know truth. And this, I would get way too far afield and all of that, but just keep in mind, right? Like in the early church, there's a reason that people turned to Rome, and part of that was the Roman hesitancy for some of the extravagant things. And I even say, like, to this day, you can just see even the way that, like, say, Pope Francis has handled the Oriental Orthodox Church, that Rome is not comfortable with things like just flippantly reordaining people because we have a severe schism and a long-lasting schism with them, which goes to say something even about Rome calling the Anglican orders null and void. I know there's some Anglicans that think that Rome was kind of flippant in her treatment of that, though I think that's arguably very much not the case. I don't think Rome is ever quick to call somebody's orders null and void. So my takeaway from all of this Well, in many ways, here from the comfort of my living room in the 21st century, it's honestly just an absolute travesty that could have been avoided if cooler heads had prevailed. And if people had been willing to view one another's positions with the greater eye of charity. Now, obviously, I am a Catholic, so I believe in the formulation of Chalcedon as put forth by Pope St. Leo the Great. But I think that the Oriental Orthodox, if nothing else, are very consistent in their view of the history, as I've stressed in this, even more so than the Eastern Orthodox in many ways. The Oriental Orthodox view Chalcedon really for what it is. It's the papacy stepping in and saying, we are overruling your council, Second Ephesus, and here is a tome that you will accept. Now, while I disagree with their beliefs around Leo's tome, I do believe that they have the correct view of the historical events. It was effectively a papal coup, if I wanted to use the hostile language of the Oriental Orthodox. And so here we are today. Okay, let's see what we got, guys. Unionist Initiative, good to see you. To understand this, you kind of have to understand. Yeah, and I really touched upon that in the first one. You really do have to make sense of the Nestorian controversy. And guys, if you are going to spend time with this, start with the Nestorian controversy, but really take your time with what's happening, because once you get to something like the 3 chapters later on in Justinian's time, you will like, okay, what is happening here when you first are introduced to it, because it's so convoluted at times, making sense of who's on what side, why are we condemning this person for something that sounds very similar to what we ourselves believe, where is the nuance in all of this language. And I do think, and I said this last time, with Pope St. Leo's, while Pope St. Leo's tome kind of cuts through the nonsense and really he kind of lays it down. At the same time, I think there is a certain subtlety to what he is. I mean, because there's an accusation, the Oriental Orthodox will make the accusation that Pope Leo's tome is actually Nestorian. And from a cursory level, they could have a fairly decent argument to make about that. But with the later sort of developments of the crystal now, and I know you could take somebody like Sergei Bulgakov and his Lamb of God book. He makes the argument in the 20th century that, excuse me, he would have been writing in the 20th century, that Chalcedon didn't actually really, Chalcedon was just sort of like a foundation Christology that we could still actually build upon. And I think there's a case to be made that that's actually, there's some truth to that. But there's enough maneuverability there where the subtlety of Leo's language allows for us, were you to want to be with an uncharitable eye, like I think many of the Oriental Orthodox of that day were, where you want to read Leo's tome as a Nestorian, there's the chance that you could. But reading it charitably and getting what the context of what Leo is trying to get at with Christ's human nature, specifically as it relates to the Nestorian controversy, it's hardly. Oh, here, yeah. I mean, this is what Unionist follows up with it, right? The tome is embarrassingly misunderstood, and I agree with that. And I think it's one of those like great moments of history where had say Cyril, gosh, if Cyril had been alive just a few decades longer, like what would the history have been? I don't say. I don't say. I mean, the Oriental Orthodox claim Cyril as their own. I don't think it's the correct reading of Saint Cyril. I think Cyril is clearly within the bounds of orthodoxy, and I, in my heart of hearts, truly believe that Cyril would have signed off on Leo's tome. But history is a tricky thing like that, and where we're left to speculate. And Unionist has some really great comments here and some points that he's bringing up. The Eastern Orthodox argue that Leo's tome was orthodox and Ephesus II should never have happened if the papal supremacy was true. It's a bit, yeah, it's really like, I tell people like, go, I've heard a few people bring this point up where I really I try to avoid the Catholic Eastern Orthodox debate so much because I just generally don't find the Orthodox arguments all that compelling. But one of the things I think is hilarious about their arguments is that they act like, one, when you try to undermine the Catholic position at times as an Eastern Orthodox, you're kind of sawing the branch that you're sitting on. So when you like make some of these arguments that by undermining the Catholic position, by somehow, like, their logic is by default the only other position available to people is the Eastern Orthodox. In many ways, you've undermined the Eastern Orthodox if you want to keep a consistent history by the time that you've undermined the Catholic Church. So I don't think it follows, and I've heard several people like point this out as well, that to have the Catholic position undermined is by default somehow magically makes the Eastern Orthodox position the position that holds. If you think that's the case, sit down and talk to some Oriental Orthodox. It's good to talk about the Assyrian Church of the East or at the same time. And my pet theory is that the Lateran historians, as far as I know, get super close to our view, and even Cyril made exceptions to the moderate Antiochians. This also explains some of the later confusions with Pope Vigilius. Yeah, I'd actually like to reach out to me, unionist, on Twitter or something. I'd actually like to talk with you about that, because I don't know as much about the Assyrian Church of the East as I would like to. I know some of the rites that come back into communion with Rome. I don't know. I sometimes in my like over intellectualizing mind, I'm like, was it really a good idea to breach these schisms and pull these people into communion before we've worked out all of the nuances? But at the same time, I submit to Holy Mother Church when there's so many examples of this, right? Like, and don't get me wrong, I love our Eastern Catholic brethren. I truly do think that there's probably it's left to the work of the saints to figure out how the Eastern Catholics, in all of their diversity, the Western Church has always, in my opinion, sought to really view these people with the eye of charity and try to, when we read a Dionysius, when we read when we read St. John, when we read the Damascene, right, to read these people with the greatest eye of charity that we possibly can. And even where it seems like there's points where we would interlock to try to like push through that and penetrate. So I would like to get your opinion on that a little bit more. Maybe even if you'd be willing to come on the channel at some point, we can talk about that. All right, guys, that's all I got for you today. I hope you enjoyed that. I do have to run. I will maybe pick this up and we can go into some detail. If you guys want to cover maybe the councils in a little bit more detail, I would certainly like to cover, gosh, what did I was saying it just a little while ago. Oh, the Byzantine papacy. The Byzantine papacy is super fascinating. Like from Vigilius moving forward, this like line of popes that are appointed by, or at least approved, the polite way to say it would be, their appointment is approved by the imperial powers. And Eamon Duffy, he's a pretty good historian overall. He's not so great about the antiquity. He does a pretty good job of like covering the medieval church, but he did make a great observation about the Byzantine papacy, which was that it's one of the great ironies of history that the Roman Church under the papacy really began to come into its own and forcefully push back against the imperial powers and Caesaro-papism of the East under the captivity of the so-called captivity of the papacy itself by the Greeks. So anyways, guys, take care. God bless you all. I will see you next time.
Honey, their coffee can't hold a candle to yours.
Instant Folgers taste good as fresh perked.
This is Earth, the year 2100. This is the headquarters of Space Patrol. And men from Earth, Mars, and Venus live and work there as guardians of peace.
In the nation's capital, President Johnson today welcomed British Prime Minister Douglas Hume.